Welcome back to Coloring Through the Bible. My name is Keegan Harkins, and today we're talking about Exodus chapter 16. We're only 2 months into the Israelites' journey into the wilderness. They've seen God do really huge miracles, and they've even seen Him take care of their small problems. But now, 2 months into their great escape, the Israelites are ready to give up. Verse 3 tells us that they go to Moses and they start whining. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. They've totally forgotten that Egypt wasn't this wonderful place, because they go on to say, kind of reminiscing about where they came from with a totally skewed point of view. They talk about how they sat around huge pots of meat and they ate all the food that they wanted. And then they accuse Moses that he's brought them out into the desert to starve to death. They sound so desperate. And God does, in fact, answer their cry, and He provides manna, and then He provides huge flocks of quail for them to eat, proving, again, that He's able to give them what they need. But I want to talk about this complaint that they had. They will frequently say it would have been better for us if we had stayed in Egypt. They even plan at one point to head back to get rid of Moses, elect a new leader, and go back to Egypt. But was life so good in Egypt? It couldn't have been if they wanted to leave it so badly. They cried out to God, "Save us from captivity." But then, as soon as things get uncomfortable, they want to run right back to what they know, what's familiar. And I think that is something that is a very human in nature. When things are uncertain and they get a little bit uncomfortable, it's so very compelling to want to go back to what we know, even if it's not good for us. At least it's familiar. And that's really a dangerous trap that we can all fall into. And I also kind of want to point out something here. They're complaining that they're going to starve to death. But if we think back and we look at Exodus chapter 12, in verse 38, when it mentions them leaving, it describes them leaving not only with all of the people, but it says that they left with flocks and herds and a lot of cattle. So maybe the problem wasn't so much their lack of supplies, but maybe the problem with both of those things was a lack of contentment. See, learning to be content brings peace. It helps us to understand all the ways that God provides for us, but it's something that takes practice and it takes faith. You can't be content if you don't trust. And I think that's the big issue for both of those. They wanted to go back to what they knew because they weren't trusting God to lead them into unfamiliar territory. And the same is true of us. When God is calling us into something that's unfamiliar, it's so very tempting to get scared and want to return back to what we know. And when we have those moments of fear, think about Peter. He stepped out of the boat because Jesus said, come out of the boat, walk on water with me. And he did. He stepped out of that boat. He had courage. And then he started to doubt and he started to sink. It's the same thing the Israelites are doing. God called them out of Egypt and they left and they started going and they were all gung-ho. And then 2 months into it, they got scared and they wanted to go back. And they started to sink in doubt. And we do the same thing in our lives. It's human nature. But what's God's nature is faithful consistency. If God calls us out of Egypt, calls us out of the boat, calls us to a new job, calls us into the mission field, whatever God is calling you to do, if God calls, we can have faith and trust that voice. Because if He's leading us down a road, He isn't going to leave us. He's going to walk right with us the whole way. And like the Israelites, Sometimes it takes a while to get to that promised land. And sometimes we get there and it feels like we've gotten there by the skin of our teeth. They're complaining that they don't have any food, and yet they can hear the cattle making noise in the background and the sheep and the goats making noise. So they weren't desperate, but they were uncomfortable. Of course, they couldn't eat all their flocks and herds because then they really would have had nothing. But they weren't desperate. And when we are heading down and we get uncomfortable, we need to fight that urge to want to return to what we understand, what we're comfortable with. Because we may never know the bounty that God has in store for us if we stop halfway and go back. And I don't want to quit. I want to know what the promised land is like. This is the land flowing with milk and honey. I mean, when they get there, they bring back grapes that are so big they have to hang them over a tree branch and carry them between two people. That's how big these grapes are. They're huge. The land is so full of things for them, but they have to get there. And God has something planned for us, and we have to get there. But don't give up. We can be content because we can trust the one who's leading us through uncomfortable circumstances on the way to our promised land. I hope you've been encouraged today by this, and I hope these flies that are buzzing around haven't been a total distraction because they're driving me insane. I hope that you have a truly blessed day, and I will see you next week.